There is a photograph from my wedding morning that I still can't look at for very long. In it, I'm standing at the tall window of a dressing room above Halloway Orchard, half into my dress, one shoe on, laughing at something my maid of honor said, and behind me on the sill sits a small brown parcel wrapped in the wrong kind of paper. Butcher paper, folded at the corners like a sandwich. I didn't know yet what was inside it. In the photograph, I look like a woman who thinks the worst part of her life is finished. My name is Tamsin Ellery, and for 22 years my family believed I stole from my grandmother while she was dying. That belief is the axle everything in my life turned around, where I lived, who I married, the career I built by hand out of nothing, the way I hold my shoulders when I walk into a room. I want to tell you how the lie was made, and I want to tell you how it broke. Because it broke in front of 140 people on the best day of my life, and not one of them made a sound. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where the wound started, because you won't understand the gift until you understand the woman who sent it. My mother is named Rosamund. She is the kind of beautiful that other people describe as put together, which is a way of saying that the surface has never once slipped in public. I have watched her cry at 3 funerals with mascara that did not move. She has a laugh she uses for company and a different, flatter sound she uses for her children. And by the time I was 6, I could tell the difference from another room. She grew up poor in a mill town 2 counties over and spent her whole adult life making sure no one would ever guess it. Appearances weren't vanity to my mother. They were survival, and then they were religion. There were 3 of us under her roof. My father, Errol, a soft-spoken man who sold agricultural insurance and believed that the way to keep peace was to agree with whoever had spoken last. My sister, Linnea, 2 years older, with our mother's coloring and our mother's instinct for the surface of things. And me. I had my grandmother's dark straight hair and a habit of asking questions at the exact wrong moment. And by the time I was 9, I understood, in the wordless way children understand these things, that in the ledger of our house, I was a debit and Linnea was a credit. I don't want to make it sound loud. That's the first thing people get wrong about houses like mine. It was never loud. My mother never once hit me. She did something quieter and more permanent. She curated. When Linnea got an A, it went on the refrigerator and it went into a phone call to my grandmother and it went into the story my mother told at the holiday table. When I got an A, my mother would look at it and there would be a small pause and then she would say, "Well, you're the smart one, we know that," in the same tone you'd use to mention that it was raining. My accomplishments were facts. Linnea's were events. I could give you 100 small examples, but I'll give you the one that still sits in my chest. When I was 11, I made the district spelling final. It was the first thing I'd ever been genuinely, publicly good at, and it was held on a Thursday evening at the high school 40 minutes away. I asked my mother in the morning if they were coming. She was doing her face at the kitchen mirror, and she said, without turning around, "Linnea has her recital Thursday, you know that." I did not know that. Linnea's recital had, until that morning, been on Saturday. I found out years later, Linnea told me herself, drunk at a cousin's engagement party, laughing like it was a charming story, that our mother had called the dance studio and asked them to move Linnea's slot. Not to hurt me. That's the part that took me decades to understand. My mother didn't move the recital to keep me from spelling. She moved it because a recital was a performance she could sit in the front row of and be seen at, and a spelling bee was a room where her daughter might lose in front of strangers. My triumphs carried risk. Linnea's were safe. She was managing exposure, the way she always did. I came in second in the district that Thursday. My grandmother drove herself the 40 minutes and sat in the third row in a green wool coat and clapped so hard when they called my name that a woman in front of her turned around. I still have the little brass medal. It's the only thing from that year I kept. There were other examples, smaller ones, that stacked up over the years into a kind of weather I lived inside without noticing it was weather. There was the winter I asked for a chemistry set for my birthday and got a set of hand towels. You're always so practical, while Linnea, whose birthday fell 3 weeks later, got a bicycle with a basket because she has such a hard time when things aren't fair. There was the way our mother introduced us to strangers. This is Linnea, our social one, and this is Tamsin, our bookworm. And the way bookworm landed a half step below social, a fraction, but I heard the fraction. There was the school portrait day when the photographer's package came back, and my mother framed Linea's and put mine, unframed, in the drawer where the batteries and the takeout menus lived. And when I found it there at 12, I understood that a drawer is also a sentence. I don't tell you these to collect sympathy. I tell you because the pattern is the point. A single cruelty you can survive and forget. It's the pattern that teaches a child who she is. By 13, I had learned the central lesson of that house so thoroughly I mistook it for a fact about the universe. That I was the one who cost the family something just by existing, and that my job was to cost it as little as possible. I got quiet, I got useful. I did the dishes without being asked, and I kept my grades where they wouldn't draw attention, and I learned to read my mother's moods the way sailors read a sky. And none of it ever moved me up a single line in the ledger, because the ledger had been written before I could read. I have to tell you about my grandmother now because she is the whole heart of this. Her name was Adaline. She was my mother's mother, which I never fully understood because they were nothing alike, as if my mother had been assembled specifically to be the opposite of everything Adaline was. Adaline was loud and warm and improper. She said what she thought at the dinner table and then laughed at the silence it made. She had been widowed young and had run a small stall at the county antiques market for almost 40 years, and she knew the true value of things the way some people know the weather in their knees. Not the price. The value. She used to say those were different words, and only fools thought they meant the same thing. She saw me, that's the plainest way I can put it. From the time I was very small, she treated me not as the difficult one, but as the interesting one, and I would have walked into a river for the difference. When I stayed at her house on Kestrel Lane, a narrow two-story with a porch that sagged on the left and shelves in every room, she'd put a thing in my hands, a chipped teacup, a tarnished spoon, a piece of costume jewelry, and she'd say, "Tell me what it wants to be worth, and then tell me what it's actually worth, and tell me how you know." And I'd turn it over and look for the marks and the wear and the repairs, and she'd nod or she'd correct me. And it was the only place in my childhood where being observant was a gift instead of a threat. Saturdays at the antiques market were the best hours of my childhood, and I'd trade every other memory to keep them. She'd pick me up before dawn in her rattling wagon with the coffee-stained seats, and we'd set up her stall by lantern light, the folding tables, the felt cloths, the trays of small tarnished things, and then the day would open and people would come, and I'd watch her work. She was ruthless and she was honest, which most people think can't both be true. She never once cheated a buyer, but she never once let a buyer cheat her either, and she taught me the whole art of the thing in her offhand way, between customers, popping a hard candy in her cheek. "See how that man handled the sugar tongs? Rough. He doesn't love them, he wants to flip them. Charge him full. See how that girl held them? She'll keep them her whole life. Come down a little for her, that's not charity, that's putting a thing where it'll be held." Held, even then. It was the whole of her philosophy, and it was hiding, all along, in the back of a locket I wasn't allowed to keep yet. She taught me the marks, the little stamps on silver that tell you the city and the year, and the maker if you know how to read them, and she made a game of it, sliding a spoon across the felt to me and covering the mark with her thumb and saying, "Guess before you look." And when I guessed right, she didn't praise me the way you praise a child. She praised me the way you'd nod at a colleague. "That's it, that's exactly it, you've got the eye." Nobody in my life had ever spoken to me as though I were an equal worth respecting, and I would have set my own hair on fire for the chance to hear her say it again. I didn't know it then, but she was doing something deliberate. She was building a person a little at a time, in the one child she'd decided the family was going to try to throw away. She wore one piece of jewelry every single day of her life that I knew her, a garnet locket. It hung on a fine gold chain, and the front was worked in a pattern of leaves around a single dark red stone the color of a pomegranate seed, and inside were two tiny photographs, her mother on the left and her husband on the right, both long dead. On the back, engraved in a script so worn you had to tilt it to the light, were the words she'd had put there herself the year she was widowed: "Held, not spent." Her own little motto, "Held, not spent," she used to touch it when she was thinking. When I was 15, she took it off one afternoon and put it in my palm, warm from her skin, and closed my fingers over it. "Not to keep yet," she said. "To know, when I go, this comes to you. Not to your sister, not to your mother, to you. Because you're the only one of them who knows the difference between held and spent." And she made me say it back to her. I stood in her kitchen with the locket in my fist and I said, "It comes to me." And she said, "Say the rest." And I said, "Held, not spent." And she smiled like I'd passed a test I didn't know I was taking. She wrote it down, too. I know that now. At the time, I only knew that she'd told me, and that a promise from a Medallion was the most solid thing in my world. She got sick the winter I was 16. It was fast and it was ugly, and my mother, to her credit or maybe just to her instinct, was the one who moved into the house on Kestrel Lane to nurse her through the last months. My mother is very good in a crisis that has an audience. Casseroles arrived, and my mother received them at the door with the exact correct expression. She sat by the bed for the visitors. And I want to be fair, because fairness is the only weapon I have left in this. She did wipe her own mother's mouth and change her own mother's sheets, and that is not nothing, and I have spent years trying to hold that truth in the same hand as everything else. Adaline died on the 9th of March the year I turned 17. I was allowed to see her twice in that last month. The second time, 3 days before the end, she was thin as paper and her mind came and went, but she caught my wrist with a grip that surprised me and she said, "You remember." Not a question. I said I remembered. She said, "Your mother is going to be very sad and very tired, and she is not always kind when she's tired. You be patient with her, but you remember what's yours." I said I would. That was the last real thing she said to me. The locket was around her neck. I saw it. I want you to hold on to that fact the way I've held on to it for 22 years, because it becomes the center of everything. On the last day I saw my grandmother alive, the garnet locket was around her neck, and everyone in the room knew it belonged to me. The funeral was large. My mother wore black that fit her perfectly and accepted condolences in the church vestibule like a woman receiving a title. I remember almost nothing of it except the smell of lilies, which I still cannot stand, and the moment at the graveside when I looked at my mother's throat and saw the fine gold chain there, and the garnet, catching the gray light. She was wearing the locket. I told myself it was only for the day. It was her mother, of course she'd wear it to bury her, she'd give it to me after when things settled. That's what I told myself for about 2 weeks. And then one evening at dinner, pot roast, I remember, and Linnea talking about a boy, I found the courage and I said into a lull, "Mom, when do you think I could have Grandma's locket?" She wanted me to have it, she told me. I have replayed the next 10 seconds more times than any other 10 seconds of my life. My mother set down her fork. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her before, something almost like relief, as though I'd finally handed her the tool she'd been waiting for. And she said, "Tamsin, honey, what locket?" I said, "The garnet one, Grandma's, the one she wore every day, the one she promised me." And my mother turned to my father and then to my sister and she said, in a voice full of terrible, gentle sorrow, "The garnet locket went missing from your grandmother's things the week she passed. I've been sick about it. I didn't want to say anything." She let a silence open. Then, softer to me, "Sweetheart, did you take it?" I want you to understand the trap of that question, because it is a masterpiece and it took me years to see all its moving parts. If I said no, I was denying, and denial is what a guilty person does. If I got angry, I was overreacting, and overreaction is what a guilty person does. If I cried, I was manipulating. There was no answer that wasn't evidence. She had built a room with no door in it and walked me into the middle and turned on the light. I said I didn't take it. I said Grandma promised it to me. Why would I take a thing she was going to give me? And my mother nodded slowly, the way you nod at someone you love who is lying, and she said, "Then it'll turn up, won't it?" And she picked her fork back up. And across the table, my sister Linnea looked at me, and I swear to you there was the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth, and I understood that whatever had just happened, the two of them already knew how it ended. It got worse from there, and it got worse in the specific way my mother was a genius at, which was never a single blow but a long, slow accumulation that no one could point to. Within a month, there was a story. The story was that Tamsin, grieving and troubled, had taken the locket from her grandmother's jewelry box and sold it. My mother never said it to me directly again. She said it in the air around me. She'd be on the phone with an aunt and I'd hear. And of course the locket, which we still haven't, well, you know? And a sigh. She told my father's sister that she'd found a pawn ticket. There was no pawn ticket, but the shape of it hardened, and by summer it had a location, a little shop called Cobbett's 2 towns over that bought gold, and it had a number, $400. My mother told people, with a catch in her voice, that her 16-year-old had pawned her dead grandmother's locket for $400, and that she'd chosen not to press it, out of love, out of grief, out of a mother's endless forgiveness. I remember the exact evening the story went from a shadow to a shape. It was a Sunday, and my father's sister, my Aunt Merritt, had come for supper, and I was clearing plates, and I came back into the dining room quietly on socked feet and heard my mother mid-sentence, in the low, confiding voice she saved for the delivery of terrible gifts. And I found where she'd taken it. A place called Cobbetts, 2 towns over. $400, Merritt, her own grandmother's, 3 weeks in the ground. And my aunt made a soft, wounded sound, and my mother said, "I've decided not to make anything of it. What would it do but break her more? She's suffering enough with the guilt, you can see it on her." And my aunt looked up and saw me standing in the doorway with a stack of plates, and her whole face changed, not toward me, but away from me, a door closing behind her eyes, and I understood that I had just watched a lie be handed from one adult to another like a warm dish, and that I would never be able to take it back off the table. I want to be exact about the machinery here because the machinery is the horror of it. My mother did not need me to confess. She did not need evidence. She invented the evidence, a shop name and a number, knowing no one would ever check because who checks their own grieving mother? She only needed the story to be told by the right person in the right voice to enough people, and the story would do the rest, the way water does the rest once you've dug the channel. Within a year, there were relatives who looked at me with a careful pity that was worse than dislike. Within 2, I had stopped correcting anyone, because I had learned that correcting the story only made me look like a girl who couldn't let go of her guilt. Do you see what she'd done? She hadn't just taken the locket. She'd taken it and made me the thief and made herself the martyr who forgave the thief. She got the object and the moral high ground in a single motion. For the rest of my time in that family, every failure of mine was hung on that nail. When I was moody, it was the guilt. When I was distant, it was the shame. When I left for college on a scholarship she'd told relatives I'd probably lose, my leaving became, in her telling, a girl running from what she'd done. I did not sell my grandmother's locket. I want to say that plainly here in the middle of this, even though by the end you'll have proof and won't need my word. I never touched Cobbetts. I have never in my life set foot in it. But when a mother stands in a kitchen with wet eyes and says a thing about her child, people believe the mother, and the child learns that the truth is a currency that doesn't spend. I left at 18 and I did not go back except for the obligatory holidays, and I stopped even those by 24. But the lie left with me, that's the thing no one tells you about being cast out of your own story. It follows. When I was 23, I was engaged to a decent, cautious man named Peter, and his mother, at some family lunch, asked mine to tell a funny story about little Tamsin, and my mother told the locket story. Told it as a warm, rueful, we're all past it now anecdote about a difficult phase. I watched Peter's mother's face change. I watched something get filed. Peter and I did not marry. There were a dozen reasons, and that was not officially one of them, but I knew and my mother knew, and when she called after the engagement ended, she said, "These things happen, honey, don't be hard on yourself." And I could hear, underneath it, satisfaction sitting down in a chair. Here is where the story turns, and I need you to feel the turn, because everything I built after this is the reason the ending lands the way it does. The years right after Peter were the worst of my life, and I'll be honest about them because I think the honesty is what makes the rest mean anything. I moved to a city 300 miles from Kestrel Lane, into a studio apartment over a laundromat where the floor was always faintly warm and smelled of dryer sheets, and I took whatever work I could get filing at a title company, then a stretch waiting tables at a chop house where the owner shorted our tips, then a temp job cataloging donations at a charity warehouse. I was 24, then 25, then 26, and the story had done its deepest damage in a place no one could see. I had come to half believe it myself. Not the facts, I knew I'd never touched Cobbetts, but the verdict underneath the facts. That I was, at the root of me, a person who took things she wasn't owed. That love, when it was offered, was being offered to a counterfeit, and would be withdrawn the moment I was seen clearly. I let 2 good things end in those years because I was so certain they'd end anyway that I hurried them along. The way you'll drop a plate you're sure is slipping. What saved me in the end was the one thing that couldn't be argued with. Objects don't care what your mother said about you. A silver spoon is a certain age or it isn't. A garnet is real or it's glass. In a world where the truth about me had been a matter of who told the story loudest, the truth about a thing was a matter of evidence, and evidence I could handle. I didn't understand yet that I was drawn to appraisal because it was the exact opposite of my childhood. I only knew that, when I held an old object and read it correctly, something in my chest went quiet. I could have become bitter and small. There were years I nearly did. But somewhere in my middle 20s, broke and alone in a city where no one knew the story, I walked past an estate sale being run out of a dead judge's brownstone, and I stopped, and I picked up a silver box off a table and turned it over and read the marks, the way Adalyn had taught me, and a tired man in a cardigan watched me do it and said, "You know what you're looking at." I said, "Not really." He said, "You're lying. You knew before you turned it over that the finial was replaced. I saw your face." That was Dorothea's husband, running the sale for her. Dorothea Kell was one of the most respected estate appraisers in 3 states, and 2 weeks later she took me on as an assistant because, she told me later, she had never seen anyone handle an object the way my grandmother had taught me to handle it, as though it were telling the truth and my only job was to listen. Dorothea was not warm the way my grandmother had been warm. She was exacting and impatient, and she made me do things 11 times until they were right, and I loved her for it in a way I've never fully been able to explain, because her impatience was the first thing anyone had aimed at me in years that assumed I was capable of better. Adaline had believed in me softly. Dorothea believed in me the hard way, which at 26 was exactly the way I needed to be believed in. The first year she barely let me touch the good pieces. The second year she started sending me alone to look at estates and come back with an opinion I had to defend. "Don't tell me what it is," she'd say. "Tell me how you know, and then tell me how you'd survive a lawyer trying to take it apart." That sentence rebuilt my mind. I stopped thinking in impressions and started thinking in proof. I apprenticed under Dorothea Kell for 6 years. I learned gemology properly, got my certifications, learned to date a chain by its clasp and a photograph by its paper, and a jeweler's mark by the county it came from. I learned to write appraisals that held up in probate court and insurance dispute and divorce, which meant I learned to build a claim out of physical evidence so solid that no grieving, lying, well-dressed person could talk their way around it. I did not know, then, that I was training for one specific afternoon of my life. I thought I was just becoming good at the one thing my grandmother had seen in me. By the time I was 34, I had my own practice. Families with old money and old jewelry called me by name. I authenticated a collection for a museum. My work was quiet and exact, and it was mine, and the thing my mother had used to destroy me, jewelry, value, the difference between held and spent, had become the ground I stood on. I never once said that out loud to anyone, but I felt it every time I closed my hand around a locket that wasn't mine and told its owner the truth. I met Cormac when I was 36. He restores old timber frame barns, which is a strange and beautiful and vanishing trade, and we met because a client of mine had bought a property with a collapsing barn and a sideboard full of Georgian silver. And Cormac and I ended up eating cold sandwiches on the tailgate of his truck, arguing about whether it's ever right to make an old thing look new. He said, "No, you honor the age. You make it sound and safe, but you let it look its age." I said that was the truest thing anyone had ever said to me about anything, and I think I loved him from that sentence forward. When we got engaged, the question of my family sat between us like a piece of furniture we kept walking around. Cormac had met them once. At a dinner I'd agreed to out of some exhausted sense of duty, and he'd watched my mother tell a story about me, a small one, a needling one, and afterward in the car he'd been very quiet and then he'd said, "She does it so smoothly. If I didn't know you, I'd have believed her." And I'd said, "Yes, that's the whole thing right there. That's the whole thing." I decided to invite them to the wedding. I've been asked why, many times, by people who love me and think I owe those people nothing. The honest answer is that I wasn't inviting them. I was inviting the possibility that I'd been wrong about them. I was leaving a door open one last time, mostly so that I could finally close it knowing I'd left it open. I sent the invitation to the house on Kestrel Lane, addressed to my parents, and a separate one to Linnea, who was by then married with 2 children and living an hour away, and had, over the years, sent me exactly 2 text messages, both asking for money. My mother's reply came on a card in her lovely upright hand. She wrote that she was sorry, but she and my father would not be able to attend, as they had a prior commitment that weekend that could not be moved, a long-planned trip. She wrote that she wished us every happiness. And then, in a smaller line at the bottom, she wrote, "I'll send something. A wedding should have a gift from a mother." I read it standing at my kitchen counter, and I felt the old cold hand on the back of my neck, and I told myself I felt nothing. I found out later there was no trip. Of course there wasn't. She stayed home that weekend. Linnea told me Linnea tells me things now, which is a later part of this story. My mother skipped my wedding not because she was elsewhere, but because a wedding is a room she could not control, full of my people, my clients, my life, a room in which I would be the credit and not the debit for once, and she could not sit in the third row of that. So she stayed away. And she sent a gift instead. Because a gift is a thing you can control, and she has always understood the power of the object over the presence. The morning of the wedding, it rained early and then cleared, and the light through the orchard was the pale gold you only get after rain. I got ready in the room above the barn at Halloway with my two closest friends and Dorothea Kell, who at 71 had insisted on being there and had appointed herself, I think, as the mother of the day. The parcel arrived by courier at 11, wrapped in that butcher paper, my mother's handwriting on the front, and my friend Rena set it on the windowsill and said, "Do you want to open it now or after?" And Dorothea, who knew the whole story, looked at the parcel and then looked at me with the flat professional stillness she got when she was assessing something, and she said, "Open it now. Not in front of people, now while it's just us." Dorothea didn't argue exactly. She never argued. She just made a case and let you fail to answer it. She said, "Tamsin, you've spent a year building something. You know what's in there or near enough. If you open it up here with us, you control the room. If you open it down there, you don't." And she was right, of course she was right. She is right about nearly everything. But there was a thing in me that Dorothea, for all her wisdom, could not fully reach. And it had been in me since I was 11 years old standing in a kitchen while my mother did her face and moved a recital to keep me small. That thing did not want to be safe. It wanted to be seen. For 22 years I had been graceful in private and slandered in public, taking the true story into rooms where no one believed it and swallowing it whole. Just once, I wanted the arithmetic reversed. I wanted the truth to happen where the lie had always lived, out loud, in front of everyone, on a day that was mine. I should have listened to Dorothea. I have thought about that a great deal. But I was 37 and I was getting married in 3 hours and I was, God help me, still that 11-year-old some small place inside, and I said, "No. If she sent a gift, she can watch me be gracious about it. We'll do gifts at the reception like everything else." I wanted witnesses to my grace. That was my one mistake of the day, and it turned out to be the best mistake I ever made. Because Dorothea, bless her, quietly put the notarized page from Cobbett's and my grandmother's unopened letter into her own handbag before we went down, "Just in case," she said, and carried them into that barn on my behalf. The way a second carries a pistol to a duel he's hopping won't happen. The wedding itself I'll keep for myself, mostly. Cormac cried, which I had bet Rena $20 he would not. Dorothea read a passage about how the value of a thing is what it has survived. My father was not there to walk me down the aisle, so I walked myself, and I have never regretted a single step of that lonely, sufficient walk. We were married under the open side of the barn with the wet orchard behind us, and for about 4 hours I forgot the parcel existed. The reception was in the barn, long tables and string lights and the smell of the timber Cormac loved. Near the end, before the dancing, there's a moment at these things where people want the couple to open a few gifts, and my friends had arranged a little table. And Rena, who did not know what she was doing, who thought she was being sweet, had carried up the parcel from my mother and set it at the front because it was from the mother of the bride, and that seemed right. So there it was, in front of 140 people. My clients, my friends, Cormac's enormous warm family, Dorothea in the second row with her hands folded and her face gone very still. Linnea was there. Linnea had come, alone, and had spent the day at the edges of things, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. My parents' two seats were empty, which everyone had noticed and no one had mentioned. Cormac handed me the parcel and I felt the weight of it, and the weight was wrong. It was too light for its size, and there was something small and hard shifting in one corner, and even before I got the butcher paper off, some cold expert part of my brain, the part Dorothea had trained, was already listening. 20 years of handling other people's heirlooms had given me a thing I can only call a pre-knowledge. The way you sometimes know, from the exact click of a lock, that a door is about to open onto a room you've been in before. My hands knew before I did. I glanced up once across the barn and found Dorothea's eyes, and she gave me the smallest nod, one professional to another, and her hand was resting on the handbag in her lap. I peeled the tape. Under the butcher paper was a jeweler's box, the old-fashioned kind, hinged, covered in worn navy velvet, and I knew that box. I knew it the way you know a voice on the phone before the second word. I had last seen that box in my grandmother's bedroom on Kestrel Lane, on the top of her dresser, beside a dish of hairpins, in the last month of her life. My mother had wrapped my grandmother's own jeweler's box in butcher paper and sent it to me as though it were something she'd bought. She hadn't even given the object a fresh container. That was the tell if I'd needed one, but I didn't need one anymore. The room had gone quiet in the way a room goes quiet when a bride opens a gift. I opened the box. Inside, on a bed of yellowed cotton, was the garnet locket. The leaves worked around the pomegranate red stone. The fine gold chain coiled. My grandmother's locket that had gone missing the week she died, that I had sold at Cobbett's for $400, that had been the nail my entire childhood was hung on, sitting in a velvet box, sent to me by my mother, 22 years later, as a wedding gift. I understand now what she meant it to be. It was, in her mind, the perfect closing move, a grand gesture. The grieving, forgiving mother, unable to attend but generous in her absence, returning at last the family heirloom to her daughter on her wedding day, and never once needing to say the words "it was here the whole time," never once admitting anything, letting the gift carry the confession so that she'd never have to make one. She would look magnanimous. And to everyone who knew the story she'd spent 2 decades seeding, it would even read as forgiveness, as if she were graciously returning to the thief the thing the thief had stolen. Even in giving it back, she'd found a way to keep me the guilty one. It was, I have to admit, almost perfect. But my mother had made 2 errors, and she made them because she has never in her life understood the difference between the surface of a thing and the truth of it. That was always Adaline's line. She was giving it back to the one person alive who could read what she'd handed me. The first error was in the box itself. I told you I recognized it, my grandmother's old jeweler's box. But tucked into the lid, under the little elastic band that once held a ring, was a slip of stiff cream card, and my hands were already moving before my mind caught up. It was an appraisal tag. A professional one, I've filled out 10,000 of them. And I knew that format. It was the format of Bellamy and Sons, an appraiser and insurer 3 towns from Kestrel Lane, and it listed one item, locket, gold, garnet, Victorian, engraved reverse, an evaluation, and a date. The date was the reason the room was about to go silent. Because the date on that appraisal was 11 years after my grandmother died. 11 years after I had supposedly sold this exact locket at Cobbett's for $400. This exact locket had been carried into Bellamy and Sons and formally appraised and insured, and the name on the tag, in the space marked owner, was Rosamund Ellery. My mother had insured my grandmother's locket in her own name 11 years after telling the whole family I'd pawned it. She had valued it, protected it, kept it, and she had left the proof tucked in the lid because to her, it was just an old scrap of paper in an old box, and she has never once in her life believed that paper could speak. The second error was worse, and it was the one that made the sound go out of the room, because I was still holding the appraisal tag, turning it toward the light out of pure habit, when Dorothea Kell rose from the second row. She didn't rush. Dorothea has never rushed at anything. She walked to the front and she held out her hand, and I gave her the tag and she read it and she looked at me. And then she did the thing that appraisers do, which is she said, quietly but clearly to the whole silent room, exactly what was true. She said, Tamsin, this locket was insured by Rosamund Ellery in the name of Rosamund Ellery, valued at $1,900 on the 4th of June, 11 years after your grandmother's death. And then she turned the locket over in the light with her old sure fingers, and she read the worn engraving on the back aloud, the words my grandmother had put there the year she was widowed, and her voice did not shake at all. Held not spent, Dorothea read. And the room understood. Not all of them knew the whole story, but Cormac's family knew the outline, and my clients are not stupid people, and there is a thing that happens in a room when a lie that has been standing for 22 years falls down all at once. It's not a gasp, it's the opposite of a gasp. It is the sudden, Total, ringing absence of sound. 140 people going still in the same half second. Because every one of them has just understood something at the same time, and none of them has words for it yet. That is what happened. Everyone went silent when I opened it. And into that silence, my sister Linnea began to cry. Now, here is where I could have stood up and screamed. Here is where the loud version of this story lives, the one where I throw the locket and name my mother across a barn full of people and let 22 years come out of me like a broken pipe. I want to be honest that some part of me wanted that, and has always wanted that, and will maybe always want that a little. I didn't do it, and I didn't not do it because I'm a saint. I didn't do it because Adaline taught me something better than anger. She taught me the difference between what a thing wants to be worth and what it's actually worth, and she taught me that you don't shout the true value of a thing. You document it. You lay it out so plainly that no one, not even the person who built the lie, can talk their way back over the top of it. Quiet and total and permanent, the way a good appraisal is permanent. That is the justice my grandmother trained me for without either of us knowing. So I did not scream. I stood up in my wedding dress in that ringing silence and I said, "Thank you all for coming. I want to tell you a short story about this locket, and then we're going to dance because I've waited 22 years for this and I refuse to spend my wedding sad." And I told them, calmly, in order, the way you build a claim. I told them my grandmother Adaline had promised me this locket when I was 15 and had told me so in front of her kitchen window and had made me repeat its motto back to her. I told them she had it around her neck 3 days before she died, and that a dozen people at her funeral had seen my mother wearing it at the grave. I told them that within a month a story had grown up that I, 16 and grieving, had stolen it and pawned it at a shop called Cobbetts for $400, and that this story had defined me inside my family for the rest of my life, had cost me relationships, had been told at tables to people I was trying to build a future with. And then I told them the part I had, by then, spent a year quietly assembling. Because you didn't think Dorothea and I had walked into this room unprepared, did you? I told you I'd been trained for one specific afternoon. I just hadn't known it would be this one until my mother's RSVP arrived. When I'd gotten her card months earlier with its promise to send something, I had felt that old cold hand, and instead of ignoring it, I had, for the first time in my adult life, decided to trust it. Dorothea had been the one to name what I was feeling. I'd shown her the card across her kitchen table, and she'd read it twice and set it down and said, "She's going to send you the locket." I said that was impossible. The locket was gone, I'd sold it, that was the whole, and I stopped because I heard myself say I'd sold it, 20 years of someone else's sentence coming out of my own mouth, and Dorothea watched me hear it. "You never sold anything," she said. "And a woman like the one you've described doesn't return a thing to prove she was wrong. She returns it to prove she was right, to make the gift the last word. So," she folded her hands, "let's make sure you have the last word instead. You have months, use them like an appraiser." So I did. I took a week I couldn't really spare, and I drove the 300 miles back toward Kestrel Lane, alone, the way I'd done everything that mattered. I went to Cobbetts first. I'd built it up in my mind for 22 years as some looming place, and it turned out to be a small, tired shop between a nail salon and a vacant unit, run now by the son of the man who'd owned it back then. Gold buyers are required by law to keep records of what they purchase, names, dates, descriptions, and often a photograph, and to hold them for years. And this shop, being the kind of place that never throws anything out, had them going back decades in bankers' boxes in a back room that smelled of dust and old carbon paper. I told the son a version of the truth, that a family heirloom had supposedly been sold here around a certain date, and I needed to know whether it had. I paid his small fee. He was gone 40 minutes. When he came back, he had a photocopied ledger page and a puzzled look, and he said, "I checked the whole year, and the year before, and the 2 years after under both names you gave me. We've got no garnet locket. We've got no purchase from anyone named Ellery. Whoever told you it was sold here." And he shrugged, not unkindly. "They were telling you a story. I had it put in writing on the shop's letterhead, and I had it notarized at the bank across the street. And I sat in my car afterward and cried for a while, not from sadness exactly, but from the specific grief of holding, on one sheet of paper, proof of a thing I had needed to be true my entire life and had never once let myself fully believe. The pawning had never happened. It had never once been real. It was a number and a place name my mother had spoken into a phone 22 years ago, and everyone had simply believed the mother. And then I went to see Mr. Sherrill, and that was the visit I hadn't planned, the one that turned the whole thing from clearing my name into something my grandmother would have recognized. I'd only meant to ask a small question, whether the will had said anything about the locket. His office was above a hardware store, up a flight of stairs so narrow I had to turn sideways, and he was old, easily 80, with reading glasses pushed up into white hair and a desk drifted over with paper. He remembered Adaline. He lit up remembering her. Sharp woman, he said. Sharpest client I ever had who wasn't a criminal. I asked my small question, and he frowned, and he went very still, and then he got up slowly and went into a back room, and I heard drawers, and he was gone so long I thought he'd forgotten I was there. When he came back, he was holding a sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, and he set it in front of me with a strange care, and he said, "She left this the same day she changed her will. Told me to keep it until someone came asking the right question and not to give it to anyone who came asking the wrong one. Your mother came, years back, asking what the estate was worth. That was the wrong question. You came asking what your grandmother wanted." He tapped the envelope. "You're the first person in 22 years to ask what she wanted." It was addressed, in my grandmother's hand, for Tamsin, who knows the difference. I did not open it in that office. I carried it home unopened and I put it in a drawer and I looked at it for months, and I decided, somewhere in those months, that I would open it for the first time out loud, in front of witnesses, on the one day my mother had chosen to hand me the perfect occasion. And I had done one thing more, the thing that turned vindication into something my grandmother would have called held, not spent. I had gone to see the lawyer who'd handled Adaline's tiny estate, an old man named Sherrill who was still, barely, in practice above a hardware store. And I had asked him whether my grandmother had left any letter, any note, any expression of wishes beyond the short will everyone knew about. And Mr. Sherrill, who is old and slow and honest, had gone into a back room and come out 40 minutes later with a sealed envelope, and he'd said, "She left this with me and said to keep it until someone came asking the right question. You're the first person who ever came asking. 22 years." My mother had never asked because my mother already had what she wanted. The envelope was addressed in my grandmother's hand for Tamsin, who knows the difference. I read it to the room. I'm going to tell you what it said, because it's the only quotation from that day I'll carry to my own grave word for word. My grandmother wrote, "Tamsin, if you are reading this, then I was right, and it took them a while, and you had to come and find the truth yourself, which is a hard thing, and I'm sorry for it. The garnet locket is yours. I told your mother so in this office in front of Mr. Sherrill, and I have told it here in writing so that it cannot be a story your mother tells instead. It is worth some money. It is worth more than that to you, and I know you know the difference, which is exactly why it goes to you and not to the ones who only ever asked what it would fetch. Hold, don't spend. Not the locket and not yourself. All my love, which was never in short supply for you, whatever they made you believe. Adaline." I looked up from the letter. The barn was so quiet I could hear the string lights buzzing. And I said, "So? My mother had this appraised and insured in her own name 11 years after she told all of you I'd sold it. There is no record of me ever selling it, and I have the shop's own books to prove it. And my grandmother left written, witnessed instructions, 22 years ago, that it was mine, and that my mother had been told so to her face. I didn't steal anything. I never did. My mother took the one thing my grandmother gave me, and then she took my name along with it, and she has spent 22 years spending both. And tonight, without meaning to, she gave me back the receipt." That was the justice, not a scream. A record, entered into evidence in front of the only jury that ever mattered, the people who would go on knowing me for the rest of my life. My mother had built her standing in that family on being the wronged and forgiving mother of a thief. In 11 minutes, without raising my voice, I dismantled the foundation she'd stood on for 2 decades, and I did it with her own paper, my grandmother's own words, and a notarized page from a pawnshop that never bought a thing. She wasn't even in the room to defend it. She'd made sure of that herself. She'd skipped the wedding to stay in control, and in staying away, she'd handed me an unanswered floor. Then I put the locket on. I fastened my grandmother's garnet locket around my own neck, in my wedding dress, 22 years too late and exactly on time, and I felt the small, warm weight of it settle where it had always belonged, and I said, "Now we're going to dance." And we did. Linnea found me by the drinks near midnight. She was wrecked, mascara gone the way our mothers never did, and she said, I knew, I've always known. She gave it to me to wear to my prom, Tamsin. She took it out of a drawer and told me not to tell you, and I was 17 and stupid, and I wore it and I never said anything, and I've thought about it every day for. And she couldn't finish. And I want to tell you I forgave her cleanly in that moment, but the truth is more like Adaline's truth, more like held. I said, you were 17. She was the adult, but you're not 17 now. And Linnea said, no, I'm not. And something started that night that is still slowly being built between my sister and me, plank by plank, the way Cormac builds sound and safe, but you let it look its age. I learned the rest of it from her over the following year, in careful phone calls and one long lunch where neither of us ate much. She told me our mother had worn the locket for the first few years openly, at church, at funerals, daring anyone to remember it was supposed to be missing, because that's the genius of a big lie told with a steady face. It hides best in plain sight. She told me that when relatives eventually stopped mentioning it, our mother had put it away in the velvet box, and that every so often, at some family occasion, she'd take it out and wear it and there'd be a specific glitter in her eye. And Linnea, who is not stupid, had understood even as a teenager that the locket was a trophy, not a keepsake. A trophy of a war our mother had won against her own child. Linnea carried that knowledge for 2 decades and said nothing, and she has to live with that. And I have decided that her living with it is not a thing I am required to make easier or harder. I just get to build a new thing beside it, at my own pace, and watch whether it holds. You'll want to know what happened to my mother. It's less dramatic than the barn and more permanent, which is fitting. I never had a screaming confrontation with Rosamund. I never called her to shout. What happened instead is that the story got out, not because I pushed it, but because 140 people had watched it fall down, and stories that fall down in barns don't stay in barns. Within a season, the version of my mother that everyone had believed, the elegant, wronged, endlessly forgiving mother, had quietly been replaced, in the minds of the aunts and cousins and church friends, with the version that was true. No one confronted her either. They just began, one by one, to disbelieve her. She lost the thing she'd traded her own daughter's name for. She lost the surface. And for my mother, who built her whole life on the surface of things, on being put together, on the front row and the perfect black dress and the story told just so, losing the belief of everyone who mattered to her was the one loss that could actually reach her. My grandmother could not have designed a straighter justice if she'd tried. Maybe she did. My mother sent one more card that autumn. It said she was sorry things had been misunderstood over the years, and that she hoped we could move forward. No confession, not even now. The same woman who tucked a self-incriminating appraisal into a velvet box could not put 4 true words on a card. I did not reply. I am not required to move forward on the timeline of the person who spent the years I'm supposed to move past. Held, not spent. I hold my mother at exactly the distance she earned, and I have stopped spending myself trying to change it. My father, Errol, who agreed with whoever spoke last, called me around Christmas and cried on the phone and said he never knew, and I believe that he chose not to know, which is a different thing, and I told him so gently and truly, and we speak sometimes now carefully about barns and weather. Here is what I have on the other side of it. I have Cormac, who honors the age of things. I have a sister I'm rebuilding. I have a practice that families trust with the objects they love, and every so often a woman my mother's age sets a locket in my palm and asks me what it's worth, and I turn it over and look for the marks and the wear and the truth, and I tell her, held, not spent, and she never knows she's watching the whole shape of my life happen in my hands. And I have the garnet locket. I wear it most days now, the way Adaline did. The photographs inside are still her mother and her husband, and I've never replaced them because they were hers, and the point of a held thing is that it carries everyone it belonged to. On the last day of my wedding, when the lights were coming down and Cormac was loading his truck with the same care he'd load a 200-year-old beam, Dorothea Kell put her old hand over the locket at my throat and she said, "Your grandmother knew what she was doing, giving this to you." I said I wasn't sure Adaline knew it would take 22 years and a wedding gift to make it right. And Dorothea smiled the way she does when a novice has almost, but not quite, gotten there, and she said, she didn't need to know the how. She just needed to give it to the one person who'd know the difference between held and spent. The rest was only a matter of time. I think about that phrase a great deal now, a matter of time, because it holds the whole shape of what happened and the whole shape of what my grandmother understood about people like my mother. A lie is a thing that has to be spent over and over to keep it alive. It has to be told again at each new table, defended at each new question, rewrapped and resent. It costs its keeper something every single day, though the keeper rarely notices the cost until the account is empty. But the truth doesn't have to be spent. The truth can be held. It can sit unopened in a drawer above a hardware store for 22 years and lose nothing, gather no interest and no debt, and simply wait for the one person who will come asking the right question. My mother spent and spent and spent for 2 decades to keep me a thief. My grandmother held and waited and did nothing at all and won. That was the lesson in the locket the whole time, engraved on the back where you had to tilt it to the light. Held, not spent. I used to think it was about money. It was never about money. She was right. It was only ever a matter of time. My mother skipped my wedding to keep control, and she sent a gift because a gift was a thing she could control, and she handed that gift to the one daughter alive who could read exactly what she'd done, in front of everyone she'd ever lied to, on the one day I finally had witnesses to my grace. I opened the box, everyone went silent, and then, 22 years too late and precisely on time, I put on what was always mine and I danced.